In our last episode, we concluded the Aro-Ibibio War and the formation of the Aro Kingdom. In continuation of our series on the Aro Confederacy, this episode is on the Anglo Aro War in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century for influence and control of trade in the bight of Biafra. The Aros had founded and incorporated many cities and settlements during the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries in the Igbo interior in the north and west of Imo River, Niger lower delta, and southeastern towards Central Africa. Helped by their influence through trade, medical knowledge, craftsmanship, military alliances, and wars. Their military power, supported by their alliances with several related neighboring Igbo and Eastern Cross River militarized states, quickly established the Aro Confederacy as a regional economic and military power. The Aro monopolized exotic trade goods. In the internal trade, commodities from the hinterland, such as implements of Igbo manufacture and slaves, were exchanged for goods and slaves from the coastal communities and later European goods. These trades burgeoned the commercial influence of Arochukwu. Before we continue on the episode, we brought to our viewers the Aro-Ibibio Wars leading to the rise of the Confederacy and now the Anglo Aro Wars. Please continue to support our History Bureau channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support is noted and would help us with the cost of bringing African history documentaries to a larger audience. Thank you very much. The Aro State and Confederation developed from a unique combination of processes that reached a culminating point in the 18th century. There were equally social, political, and economic considerations, all of which compounded to influence the evolution of the state from its inception. Trade and commerce were major factors. However, Aro's dominance and economic control will inevitably put them in direct conflict with the now ever-present European powers in the scramble for Africa. In particular, the British Empire, who were bent on expanding its empire in the interior of present Nigeria from the ocean, after the Berlin Conference of 1885, where other European powers agreed to their right of possession of the region. In the previous 40 years from 1898, the Aro had prevented the British missionaries and merchants from making inroads into the interior from the southern coast. British influence in the region began with the prohibition of the slave trade to British subjects in 1807. Britain annexed Lagos in 1861 and established the Oil River Protectorate in 1884 along the southern coast. It was renamed Niger Coast Protectorate in 1893, with its capital at Old Calabar, directly becoming a protectorate to Aro's client coastal kingdoms. British influence in the Niger area increased gradually over the 19th century, but Britain did not effectively occupy the area until 1885. From 1886 to 1899, much of the country was ruled by the Royal Niger Company, authorized by charter, and governed by George Taubman Goldie. Through a progressive sequence of regimes and events, the British imposed crown colony government on much of the area of the coastal bight of Biafra, a form of rule that was both autocratic and bureaucratic. After initially adopting an indirect rule approach by creating client kings and many protectorates and arming them to oppose their now former overlords, the Aros intending to erode their influence and weaken the Confederacy. The Aro leadership was not idle either. They knew that British penetration into the hinterlands would further destroy their remaining dominance in the interior. They also opposed the Presbyterian missionaries' attempts to establish Christianity, which threatened their religious influence through their oracle, Ibini Ukpabi. The Christian missionaries were the final covert plan by the Niger Royal Company to penetrate the interior and weaken the Aro influence after converting most of the coastal tribes to Christianity by building churches and giving them Christian names. Aro raided and destroyed British-established missionary and trade stations along the Niger and Imo rivers, as well as local client coastal kingdoms that traded and sought British protection. These raids and skirmishes with the British and their native allies will go on for years, keeping the Niger Royal Company from opening up the interior for direct British trade and market. By late 1897, it was very clear to the protectorate government that the Aro was a formidable threat to the British interest in Western Africa. Writing in May 1897, Sir Ralph Moore reported to the Foreign Secretary, "For some years now, attempts have been made to march from the Cross River at Aituu through the Aro country to the upper waters of the Opobo River, but difficulties had always been encountered which it would have been necessary to employ force. They needed to find an urgent solution before other European powers started to encroach. To this end, the native political agent on the Upper Cross River, Chief Koko Otu Bassi, was mandated by the Protectorate government to arrange for a meeting between the leaders of Aro and the High Commissioner and Consul General. Chief Bassi succeeded in fixing a meeting at ITU for August of the same year, but the High Commissioner failed to attend because of preoccupation with the Benin expedition. When the Aro chiefs arrived, they were kept at ITU for a fortnight, during which they were entertained at the expense of the government. Chief Koko Otu Bassi was then asked to arrange another meeting, but could not do so before Sir Moore left on leave in January 1898. His failure derived from the epidemic of smallpox, which ravaged the Upper Cross River through the later part of 1897. Eventually, Chief Bassi succeeded in arranging another meeting for March 1898. Major Galway, the acting High Commissioner, attended, but unfortunately the Aros were not well represented, and there was practically no result. Negotiations continued till September 1899. In his second dispatch to the Foreign Secretary, Sir Ralph Moore would advise for use of military force to settle the Aro resistance to British interests. He wrote, "I have just returned from a visit to the Niger territories during which I made inquiries with regards to the attitude of the Aros in the direction of the Niger River. There can be no doubt that if the work of the administration is to be progressive, the time has now come when the Aro tribe must be effectively dealt with. For 7 years now, steady and continuous efforts have been made to establish friendly relations with this tribe, but the intentions and objects of the government are directly opposed to those of the Aros, and it is futile to continue any further friendly gestures in this direction." By the end of the year, it was clear to both sides that war was inevitable. At this point, the Southern Protectorate was not in position to conduct entirely on its resources an operation conceived on the scale of the Aro Expedition. However, preparations for the Aro Expedition started in the year 1900 by bringing in the 3rd Battalion of the West African Frontier Force and other units from Sierra Leone and East Africa. Aros took the initiative while the British prepared for the invasion of Arochukwu. The Aro field commanders like Okoro Toti would launch major offensive raids and skirmishes against British outposts and their native allies to discourage the former client states from taking part and to disrupt the British preparations. These attacks continued all through 1900 into 1901. Okoro Toti sacked Obegu in March 1901, an important British ally which resulted in the deaths of 460 people. This attack quickened British preparation for their offensive. On the 24th of November 1901, Sir Ralph Moore published a memorandum of instructions about the Aro expedition in which he formulated the objectives of the expedition. To put a stop to slave dealing and the slave trade generally with a view to the slave dealing, Proclamation No. 5 of 1901 being enforced throughout the entire territories as from the 1st of January. To abolish the Juju hierarchy of the Aro tribe, which by superstition and fraud causes much injustice among the coast tribes generally, and is opposed to the establishment of government. To open up the country of the Aros to civilization. To induce the natives to engage in legitimate trade. To introduce currency instead of slaves, brass rods, and other forms of native currency, and to facilitate trade transactions. To eventually establish a labor market as a substitute for the present system of slavery. The Protectorate government declared war on the Aro on November 1901 and began to withdraw all the white Presbyterian agents on the Cross River at Ikot, Ofiong, and Okoyong to Calabar. It was feared the Aro might outflank the troops and capture white missionaries as hostages for imposing terms. The British combined force of the West African Frontier Force was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Montanaro, a combined force of over 2,500 soldiers and 2,300 carriers for the massive operation. Lieutenant Colonel Montanaro dispatched 4 converging columns from Oguta, Akwete, Unwana, and ITU towards Arochukwu, the capital of the Aros. It was the spiritual center of Ibini Ukpabi, and therefore Montanaro's primary target. The first column comprised of 175mm gun, 1 Maxim, 16 Europeans, and 300 native rank and file under Captain at Jackson Worcester Regiment, concentrated at Oguta and marched to Owerri. Second column comprised 2 75mm guns, 2 Maxims, 19 Europeans, and 451 native rank and file under Major Mackenzie, concentrated at Ongwana and marched into the Ohafia country. Third column, 175mm gun, 2 Maxims, 20 Europeans, and 375 native rank and file under Lieutenant Colonel A. Festing of the Royal Irish Rifles, concentrated at Akwete and marched to Owerri. Major Henniker commanded number 4 column of this expedition, his force consisting of 19 European officers, as well as 1 local officer, 479 local rank and file, 2 Maxim guns, 2 7-pounders, a 75mm gun and crew, 1 rocket tube, 13 gun carriers, and 225 general carriers concentrated at ITU. His orders were to make a feint advance towards Arochukwu to fix the Aro forces near their capital. This allowed the other columns to conduct other operations across the country and move towards the Aro capital without being ambushed too often along the way. Montanaro's major concern was not to allow the Aros to concentrate their numerically superior forces at a major point, but to fight on different axes where British superior firearms and Maxim guns would be more effective. The Aros knew about the British column and would assign their forces to engage each column. The Aro Expedition was the bloodiest British expedition on the African frontier. Aros knew they were outgunned and adapted the strategy to welter the British columns by inflicting major casualties and demoralizing the army in abandoning the campaign. On December 20th, all the columns would join forces at Esu-Itu. They engaged in 2 major battles before the Battle of Arochukwu at the Oguta-Owerri axis in November 1901 and the Battle of Esu-Itu in December 1901. The Aro Field Army withdrew towards Arochukwu after taking heavy casualties. The Maxims and 75mm guns were no match to their Dane guns, as the British avoided hand-to-hand combat. They continued harassing the columns while they withdrew and prepared for the defense of Arochukwu. The entire expedition force would arrive outside of Arochukwu on December 24, 1901, to be confronted by the significant Aro forces already in wait. The expedition forces of the West African Frontier Force now comprises 2,500 men and 87 officers, 1 7-pounder, 7 Maxim guns, 5 75mm guns, and 1 rocket tube. The British soldiers were armed with the latest Snider action bolt rifles, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel A.F. Montanaro. The Aros had about 6,000 and their allied warriors defending Arochukwu under the command of Eze Kanu Okoro. Armed with Dane guns, a few Snider rifles, 3 muzzle-loaded cannons, and swords, determined to protect their spiritual and capital city at all costs. The expedition force arrived from the south through a plain farm field, which we now know as Okoroji's farm, intending a 4-prong attack against Arochukwu, but the Aro scouts have known about their movements for weeks and laid an ambush of concealed trenches, intending to keep the entire British columns in a location and cut them to pieces. Known to them, the British had supreme firepower, which the Aros intended to mitigate by making it a close-quarter battle where their Dane guns and hand-fighting would be effective. The first column, acting as scouts, were the first to run into the 2,500 Aro warriors commanded by Mazi Okori Torti in the trenches, being covered with tufts of grass a few feet high and stunted bushes. They were met with heavy fires from the trenches as puffs of white smokes appeared from the trenches. The column would fire back towards the trenches, but they were cut out in the open and casualty and wounded began to mount. The firefight lasted for about 30 minutes as more British columns began to pour into the path. The British have gained enormous experience in the previous bush wars in West Africa by implementing scouts and flankers tactics. On entering the path, 2 columns had reinforced the first and advanced in extended order, followed by the leading Maxims and a 75mm gun, ready for action. The 3rd and 4th columns, acting as flankers, were well thrown out. The advance was continued in this formation. Aro warriors continued to pour direct fire into the columns, forming an advancing formation from the trenches, hoping to throw them into confusion before charging at them. Once the Maxims and 75mm were brought to the front, the guns opened a heavy fire, directed at the white puffs immediately in front and the 7-pounders from behind the lines. Parties were then sent right and left to outflank the trenches while they were pinned down under heavy fire from the Maxims. The Aro's contingent in the center, under tremendous fire, would charge the expedition force, hoping to overrun them and stop the Maxims in 75 millimeters, which were now causing mounting casualties. The bulk of Aro casualties were from the Maxims, having encountered its destructive power at the Battle of Oguta and Esu-Itu. Their mad charge to destroy the gun crew would expose the warrior to enormous direct fire from the Maxim machine guns and riflemen at the British center. Hundreds were cut down while the rest met the British riflemen who had waited for the charge, and a great melee ensued. The flanking parties on both sides engaged with the rest of the Aro forces in the trenches simultaneously. The fighting at the flanks was brutal, but the British began to gain the upper hand due to their superior bolt-action rifle, the ability to deliver more accurate firepower at a continuous rate, which they maximized by avoiding close hand-to-hand fighting. Commander Mazio Kori would order a complete withdrawal from the field towards Arochukwu, which is now about a few miles from the fighting. Both forces sustained casualties in the fighting that lasted about 2 hours. But the Aros were significant. They retreated behind the trenches they had dug around Arochukwu and waited for the expedition forces. Lieutenant Colonel Montanaro marched to the capital expecting a defeated enemy, but he met the rest of the Aro forces. He quickly made a fortified camp and gunner trenches, and the Battle of Arochukwu began. According to Major Williams Henniker, commanding officer of the 4 Column, the Battle of Arochukwu was the devil's baptism. The enemy was highly trained, motivated, and fought with articulated objectives unlike the frontier force had experienced anywhere. Sleep was never an option. It seems the enemy never sleeps. The Maxims and 75 millimeters were the only barrier between us, the devil. The Aro forces resumed attacks on the British on the night of December 24, 1901. The Battle of Arochukwu continued and lasted for 4 days in and around the city. The Aro tried to fight around the British firepower through indirect and flank attacks, while the British sought to keep the Aros in their direct fire. Casualties were very high for the British and Aro. On December 28th, Etse Aro and his forces defending Arochukwu withdrew towards Bende, allowing the British to capture Arochukwu. The expedition's objective was to split up the Aro forces, making it easier to capture Arochukwu by avoiding a large concentrated enemy force. Battles between British and Aro forces continued throughout the region. Eze Aro reorganized his forces and continued the war with the British at the Battle of Edima, Ikotobo, Ikorodaka until spring 1902, when Aro forces were defeated in the last major battle at Bende. The Aro expedition ended 3 weeks later. Some of the Aro military leaders and chiefs were arrested, tried by tribunals, and hanged. Eze Kanu Okoro went into exile but was later arrested. The Aro War took a massive toll on the protectorate government of manpower and resources, significantly leaving them vulnerable until they were reinforced by the Northern Protectorate. The British never really understood and underestimated the extent of Aro's power before the expedition, believing that the capture of Arochukwu would end the war. The Maxim rapid-fire field guns had won them the war. The defeat of the Aro did help the British in their imperial agenda for the conquest of the interior and serious opposition to British penetration in Igboland. However, it did not end with the Anglo Aro War. In the years that followed, the British had to deal with many other conflicts and wars in various parts of Igboland, such as Afikpo from 1902 to 1903, Eza in 1905, NRI conflict 1905 to 1911, and the Ekumeku War. The Anglo-Aro mistrust continued to play out in custody of administrative power in the colony and present-day Nigeria because of the British perception of the Igbo's unwillingness to accept British overlord, unlike other regions. Arochukwu was the last independent major kingdom in Nigeria, only falling to the British in 1902. With the end of the Anglo-Aro War, we have come to the end of the Anglo-Aro series. Please continue to watch, share, and support our channel. It helps immensely to bring these documentaries to you, our viewers, and we are looking forward to growing this channel together and bringing more African histories to our viewers. Thank you, and see you on the next one.